Warning, this video discusses sensitive themes like abuse, assault, kidnapping, and rape in a critical, analytical context. What if I told you there's a book about a brilliant female apothecary who secretly poisons abusive men to protect women? That sounds incredible, right? What if I told you that same character actually spends most of the book being stalked, overpowered, and stripped of her agency? Yeah. This is The Poisoner by Ophelia. Ophelia's highly successful debut novel, and it might be one of the clearest examples of a story collapsing under its own contradictions. What I would like to do with this video is go line by line and create a substitution for reading the book, adding my reactions and thoughts and analysis, but that's exactly what got me in trouble with copyright strike law before. So instead, I'll use a combination of summary analysis and exploration of themes in a non-linear order to avoid violating copyright law. It means I am safest if I do not show direct quotes from the text and if I do not read passages out loud. But what is The Poisoner by Ophelia about? The Poisoner is a 442-page dark romance. It has elements of fantasy, vampires, and gothic. It takes place in Victorian London. Alina is the female protagonist. She is portrayed as a skilled apothecary, one who deals with herbs, medicines, and poisons. Kind of like Batman, she is also secretly a vigilante. By day, she runs an apothecary shop. By night, she helps poison bad men. The way she helps abused women by poisoning the men who hurt them is actually a really strong premise. You've got a morally gray, highly competent female protagonist who operates outside the law and targets abusive men. On paper, this should go incredibly hard, but there's a very specific way books like this tend to fall apart, and The Poisoner is almost a perfect example of it. Because the moment the romance starts, all of that competence, all of that agency, all of that control starts to collapse, and not randomly. It collapses in a very specific, very consistent way that shows up across a lot of dark romance. And I think the root of it is something most people don't even consciously think about: purity culture. Because once you start looking at these books through that lens, a lot of the contradictions start to make sense. Why the female protagonist can be powerful in every area except her own sexuality. Why the male lead has to be controlling, aggressive, or even violent. And why so many of these stories drift into non-consensual or dubious consent territory. But let's talk about a few books that have something important in common. The vigilante aspect is similar to another book I've read before, Oops, I Ate a Vengeance Demon. The idea of a competent female protagonist who secretly hunts down bad men who hurt women. That sounds very feminist and good, but where these female vigilante books usually fail is in the romance aspect. All of their badassery goes out the window when the male main character comes along and dominates them. It was true for Oops, I Ate a Vengeance Demon, and it's true for The Poisoner. Many of the reviews for The Poisoner complain about the rape scene at the end. And reviews also said the book starts off with a strong premise, but quickly devolves into too much smut, too little plot, and an insulting rape scene. I think this perfectly encapsulates the exact problem these types of strong woman, weak lover books tend to have. There was another book, Rotten to the Core by Alexi Blake, where the female protagonist was initially portrayed as this vengeful assassin, trained since birth, determined to kill the sexy bad prince. She immediately gets caught by him upon arrival at his kingdom, and gang-raped and gang-molested by his entire court. Throughout the book, she's never able to escape his domination, despite the initial premise that she is a highly trained assassin. Now, why do all three of these books, and many others like them, have the exact same problem? It's because of purity culture. In the Poisoner book, we're supposed to believe that Alina, the main character, is a highly competent apothecary. She is portrayed like a mad scientist, brilliant but also forgetful, and does silly things like bang her head repeatedly on accident. She helps abused women by poisoning their abusers. And then all of it falls flat in the way these books try to explore non-consent or dubious consent. The badass female protagonist can do anything except avoid being slut-shamed. To avoid being slut-shamed, that requires a very rapey MMC or two. To give her permission to explore sexual fantasies. That way the responsibility falls on MMC, not her. The whole point is to avoid slut-shaming, whether the author realizes it or not. And so these romance books keep ending up with contradictory female protagonists. They're badass rebels who can't make the first move in bed. They're highly trained warriors in tune with their bodies, but also their body betrays them because their nipples harden whenever MMC walks nearby. Dubious consent and non-consent are primarily attractive fantasies to solve a problem that shouldn't exist. Women should be able to enjoy consensual, enthusiastic sex without feeling like they're doing something shameful or wrong, yet most romance books tend to portray the opposite. A rapey MMC who forces her to do things while she secretly loves it but can't admit it. Her body betraying her with unexpected arousal around MMC because conscious attraction to a man would be too shameful. This shows up in some of the kinks explored in The Poisoner, which are vampires, primal, a variation of knotting, risk-aware consent kink, chasing, biting, hair pulling, blood play, forked or split tongues, light creature features, brat/brat tamer, spitting, predicament, and mutual stalking. If you think about non-consent as a contradictory way of holding purity culture values in mind, you see why a lot of these kinks line up together. The primal kink means there's a predatory-prey dynamic, usually a chase scene, where the male character is the predator and the female character is the prey. He typically chases her around and then pins her down and has sex with her. This also falls under the category of purity culture problem. Why is it exciting for her to be pinned down, captured, trapped, and quote-unquote forced to have sex with him? The obvious answer is because she has some issue with directly expressing her enthusiastic desire to have sex with him. So she has to be hunted and forced to have sex with him to avoid guilt and shame. Same with all the chasing, biting, hair pulling, spitting stuff. They all fall under that same reasoning. And the brat or brat tamer dynamic is also the same. The woman is always the submissive brat. The man is always the dominant daddy or brat tamer who controls her, alleviating her of the guilt and responsibility for sexual exploration. The book begins with several pages of warnings about the non-consent or dubious consent content, saying that depiction is not endorsement, and explicitly outlining that this is not how it will work in real life and that this is a work of fiction. I don't know if the multiple pages of warnings came before or after all the reviews complaining about the rape scene, because the book was rewritten at some point for publisher standards to be less rapey, but nobody can read this book now and say they were not warned. So there were two versions of the book, a rapey and more brutal indie version, and then the more curated, toned down, less rapey published version. The female main character is Alina. Her bestie is also rich, Phoebe. Phoebe's mansion has many rooms full of attentive staff. They're like Wednesday Addams and Enid Sinclair. Alina is gothic and wears all black. Phoebe is bubbly, extroverted, and has strawberry curls. They have some family connections through their father. Alina's father was super dedicated to studying apothecary-related stuff, so that's supposed to explain why these two besties are rich and connected, and how they grew up together, and how Alina chose to be an apothecary. An apothecary refers to both a person and a place. Alina owns an apothecary. She is an apothecary. Synonyms are like druggist or pharmacist or chemist. Alina is not like the other girls. She owns an apothecary. She's a dedicated scientist. And in this Victorian-era setting, the author is saying that it's weird for women to be property owners and intellectuals. Alina feels smug when she makes men feel stupid by talking about her expertise and that she writes for scientific journals. So far, this characterization sounds very feminist, but don't get your hopes up, because no matter how awesome the female protagonist seems at the start, she always ends up being dominated and humiliated by the male main character. Near the beginning of the book, in the middle of a social party, a vampire guy assaults a young woman, and Alina is frozen and doesn't help even though she wants to. So immediately the badass female protagonist is shown to be helpless to MMC. Some of the chapters alternate between FMC and MMC's perspectives, but this book has the same problem that other romantasy books with alternating perspectives have. The MMC chapters basically tell us nothing in terms of plot or progression. They're always just affirmation that MMC is intensely interested in FMC. They basically serve as recap and confirmation that MMC is obsessed with the FMC. Never any real plot progression. My theory on this is that male main characters are always ridiculously masculine, to the point where you can't really write them like you'd write a real person. Their thoughts are always so unga-bunga stupid and simple. They're basically a machine designed to pursue FMC with no other real awareness. A very unsophisticated machine. That's why MMC chapters in romance books always feel very silly, shallow, and never progress the plot in any meaningful way. And I think a lot of the problem with the way male main characters are written in romance comes down to masculinity itself. Male main characters are always so derivative of stereotypical masculine traits They're always extremely tall, powerful, high social rank, rich, obsessively monogamous, etc., etc., etc. You can see the bingo chart I made full of MMC traits on screen. So many male main characters share these traits across hundreds of romance and romantasy books. It's almost comical how similar they are. And that leads to a bigger discussion about gender roles. I won't fully get into it here because that would be too distracting from talking about the book, but I will take a few minutes to say that masculine and feminine traits or tropes are derived from a bigger, shared cultural understanding of gender roles. In other words, how are men supposed to be like? How are women supposed to be like? And the biggest problem with gender roles is that they create a double standard between men and women. Men are allowed to be aggressive, rapey, pursue what they want. Women are not. Women are controlled by being told to be passive, submissive, quiet, self-sacrificing, and obedient. But when you have a seemingly feminist premise like this book, like many others, where the female protagonist appears to defy some of those expectations at first, in this case, Alina is an intellectual and vigilante and successful business person, it gets your hopes up, only to fail miserably by not dismantling gender roles for the rest of the book. FMC becomes dominated by MMC. She is immediately helpless to his superiority, no matter how badass she appeared in the first few pages or chapters. It's actually more disappointing than if you just wrote a more mild, cozy, romantic depiction of a man and woman, because the books where female protagonists appear to be badasses hurt more when they're inevitably subdued by the strong male main character. That is especially the case in Poisoner. I think the reason the non-consensual elements and rape scenes were written so brutally was exactly because of how defiant Alina appears to be at first. A more defiant woman who doesn't conform to gender roles requires more brutalizing and violence to subdue down to the point where she's not responsible for participating in sexual exploration. The level of violence is proportional to how much FMC tries to escape her gender role. I'm not saying that romance books with more feminine women have a more gentle male lead. For example, in Blood and Ash, Hawk pins down Poppy in a bed, makes an excuse to warm her up by sharing her sleeping bag as they travel through the blood forest, and does a bunch of brutal and violent stuff to establish his dominance. So clearly, male main characters are often brutal, dominating, no matter what. Like I said, they're derivative of the masculine traits on the MMC bingo card. What I am saying is that a more defiant female character requires more brutality to subjugate. That's why Poisoner has such an extended, multi-chapter kidnapping, imprisonment, torture, and rape scene at the end of the book. In order to bring down a strong woman, more violence is required. We learn that Alina gets herbs and supplies from another businesswoman to make her poisons and experiments with. It sounds illegal or shady, and that once Alina completes the poisons, she sells them to clients like Madame Bordeaux, a woman who owns a high-end brothel. This is part of the vigilante aspect. In fact, her one or two interactions with these businesswomen are the only time that the author tries to show the vigilante aspect instead of telling us about it. Alina's one rule is that her poisons must be used on abusive men. Again, it sounds really cool and feminist that Alina uses her apothecary skills to kill abusive men, men who hurt and abuse women, which is what makes it worse when Alina is eventually dominated and humiliated by stupid, rapey male main characters. What's interesting here is that the brothel is high-end, catered to wealthy clients. It's described as one of the most established brothels in the city. Please don't copyright strike me. I think this is an interesting choice by the author to make the brothel a wealthy one rather than a poor one. Why? The author wants to establish a way for Alina to use her poisoner skills to take out abusive men who really deserve it. So selling poison to a brothel where some men abuse women makes sense on a surface level. But the author doesn't want to deal with the implications of real crime and poverty, so the brothel must be wealthy, not poor. Because crime is a social construct, poverty and crime are strongly linked. Poor neighborhoods are over-policed. The justice system is completely rigged in favor of the wealthy. But rather than deal with any of that, the easiest way for the author to deliver a feel-good moment of Alina kills bad guys using her poison skills is to avoid touching on any real issues of crime, poverty, and justice. A wealthy brothel where some rich men abuse women provides the cleanest and simplest writing solution. Alina gets to murder bad men and nobody has to think too hard about it. If Luigi was a member of the US military, it wouldn't be murder, it would be thank you for your service, but when he allegedly kills a healthcare CEO who signed documents that harmed hundreds of thousands or millions of people, suddenly he's a terrorist.
No one's ever cared like that before.
Throughout the book, Silas, the MMC, stalks her. He learns her routine, all her secrets, deduces that she must be the vigilante poisoning men, and he wants to crush her ego. So most of the book is like this cat and mouse game between Silas and Alina. They each want to come out as the smarter predator. Kind of like Death Note, versus Yagami Light, but a lot simpler, and they more obviously want to have sex with each other. Silas does a lot of bad things to her. At one point, he breaks into her house while she's bathing. He pulls her out of the tub by her hair and demands they play hide and seek. With all the hair pulling and playing hide and seek, I'm not sure whether this guy is supposed to be a sexy vampire or an autistic elementary schoolboy teasing his first crush. Throughout the book, he sexually assaults her and rapes her. She's ashamed at how turned on she is. It's body betrays me rape culture bullshit, saying stuff similar to, a warmth burned in my forbidden core and other nonsense. There's a scene where Alina's being raped and she's like, why am I not screaming no more? And the implication is that she secretly wants it. Later in the book, there's a second vampire who's also extremely tall and wants her attention too, and this guy is like the backup male main character and the antagonist. He's not as alpha as Silas, but he is very attractive and shows a lot of knowledge and interest in botany, which makes him have more in common intellectually with Alina. He goes by the names Viktor, but his real name is Luka, and Viktor pretends to be this socially awkward academic. Comparing Viktor to Silas, it seems weird that Silas is who he is because he goes against everything that Alina values. Her whole thing is that she likes humiliating men, likes poisoning and killing abusive men for her own sense of justice. Yet Silas abuses, rapes, murders women, and Alina is supposed to be the most attracted to him. And then Viktor/Luka is supposed to be the bad guy, the assassin who's hired to kill her. He actually shares interests with her and initially comes across as very polite, sensitive, understanding, and sharing her dislike of crowds. But Viktor/Luka is clearly not as alpha as Silas, and Silas is the ultimate winner by the end of the book. Though Alina experiences a ton of cognitive dissonance, Silas is supposed to be everything she hates, but she's wildly attracted to him. He would be like a domestic violence lawyer who helps victims of abuse falling in love with a serial killer who preys on women. It just makes Alina seem silly and hypocritical despite her initial characterization as smart and defiant. And all of this is because of purity culture nonsense. She has to be confused and abused in order to experience sex. It has to be a rapey MMC's fault, not hers, otherwise that would make her a slut. And apparently being slut-shamed is way worse than stalking, kidnapping, abusing, raping, and murdering women. The major issue of the book is the friendship between Phoebe and Alina. They're supposedly best friends who grew up together, but the way that many of the scenes read makes you wonder if they're even friends at all. Alina hides everything from Phoebe. It feels like the only reason Phoebe exists is to de-escalate the tension between Alina and Silas. Like Phoebe is a cool girl who's supposed to contrast with Alina's dark, devious goth personality, but they never talk about anything meaningful. Alina doesn't communicate her jealousy about Silas to Phoebe. Alina hides as much as she can from Phoebe, who is supposedly her best friend. Alina hides all the sociopathic behaviors that Silas does, him breaking into her house repeatedly, stalking her, assaulting her, sexually assaulting her, leaving dissected animals around her house as gifts. It just feels like Alina and Phoebe's best friend dynamic is a stepping stone designed to show that being attracted to a dangerous man is far more fulfilling than a lifelong best friendship with another woman, which is distinctly unfeminist, despite the book starting off with a seemingly feminist premise of an unconventional woman who poisons abusive men. It Uno reverses super hard the other direction for the rest of the book, which is huge disappointment for anyone who wanted an actual feminist story, a huge disappointment for anyone who bought into the premise. So around the middle section of the book is probably the best part, because in the middle section, Alina and Silas make a deal and they interact more evenly. There's actual dialogue and exchange, not just silly banter. For a brief moment, it feels like two powerful characters negotiating power, and it totally works. But then the final act ruins everything. There's kidnapping, imprisonment, torture, repeated assault. and rape. Both Luka and Silas rape Alina together. The violence increases dramatically. And this ties back to the earlier idea. The more defiant a female character is, the more force the narrative uses to break her. The ending just falls apart. There's so many plot threads that are unresolved, rushed, or abandoned. Characters just teleport between situations with no explanation. Major events happen off-screen. It feels less like a conclusion and more like the book ran out of structure. Like when Alina wants to infiltrate a vampire nest, she just magically finds one in the very next paragraph. There's no explanation as to how. She just knocks on the door and they let her in. When Alina gets captured and put into vampire jail, Phoebe takes over a week to find Alina's vampire-killing poison vials, despite Alina telling them they're in her purse, which she had on arrival to vampire jail. And Phoebe has access to Alina the entire time, so there's no explanation as to why she took so long to get the vials back to her. There's also a scene where Silas fights Luka because Luka is the vampire assassin hired to kill Alina, and Silas doesn't want Alina to die because he's grown attached to her. So they fight in the garden of the vampire nest for several hours, but then they both just give up on fighting. Even though neither of them is like winning or losing, they just give up on fighting and there's no explanation as to why. And then in the very next scene, Silas and Luka are raping Alina together. So it's like Silas just inexplicably gives up on trying to save Alina. It just makes no sense. And Silas and Phoebe have access to Alina the entire time she's in vampire jail being tortured by Luka. But somehow they can't help her escape. Until the very end, where the book ends with a literal jump cut, where Alina is just suddenly on a boat, having escaped vampire jail with zero explanation. I could say a lot more about this book. I took over 26 pages of notes on everything important that happened, but I don't want to get copyright striked by retelling too much of the book in a linear way, so I'll just summarize what I liked and disliked. I liked the feminist premise of Alina killing bad men. I think it highlights a larger social problem around men and violent crime. Men commit nearly all of the violent crime in society, yet the discussions around gender roles tend to avoid that fact. So the feminist premise where Alina is an intelligent vigilante sounded really interesting. It immediately brings disappointment when the male main character keeps showing his superiority to her early on. But you get your hopes up again around the middle section, where Alina negotiates with Silas to exchange blood. This part portrays them more as equals, and things seem relatively consensual and pleasant for a while. What I disliked was Alina constantly being dominated, stalked, assaulted, and raped. It undermines her character to keep losing to Silas. And Silas's entire character is antithetical to Alina's sense of justice. Silas is exactly the kind of man that Alina keeps saying she hates. There were several innocent women that he murdered throughout the book. All the bad things he does to Alina I already mentioned, and in the end he just kinda gives up on fighting Luka while Alina is being tortured and raped by Luka in vampire jail. In fact, Silas even joins Luka in raping her. It just makes no sense other than what I said earlier about needing to destroy a strong woman with violence in order for her to be broken down to the point of sexual exploration without guilt. The women's friendships are always depicted as shallow and fragile. Phoebe and Alina are always hiding information from each other. Alina even gets jealous about Phoebe's relationship to Silas near the beginning of the book. There's a stupid scene where various women are talking about how hot Silas is and how much they want to have sex with him. Like the only purpose of certain random side women characters is to emphasize how attractive Silas is to women. And there's another stupid scene where Alina dunks on a random woman named Clarissa just because Clarissa expresses attraction to Silas. So the way women relationships were depicted left a very bad taste, where they're all fake as fuck and just competing for hot men. Then there's the incoherent jumps and plot holes. Like, how did Alina just instantly find the secret vampire nest when she decided she wanted to explore one? Why did the author throw in the plot twist of Phoebe also being a vampire and Silas's sister? It didn't add anything to the book other than increasing the level of random betrayal. Including her doctor, it turns out almost all the named characters in the book knew something about the vampire world and hid it from Alina. And she only finds this out at the end of the book when she is being held captive in the vampire nest and tortured and raped. What was the point of that? Just to throw the Phoebe-Alina relationship further into the gutter? The ending was especially terrible. Alina bites Luka, and then Silas fights Luka, while Luka's weakened from Alina's poisonous bite. The book just ends on a random cliffhanger. Alina is suddenly on a boat to New York with Phoebe. Zero explanation as to how Alina and Phoebe escaped the nest. Zero explanation as to whether Silas finished off Luka or survived. Zero explanation as to anything that happened to Silas and Luka. And finally, the body betrays me bullshit where Alina secretly loves being raped. Scenes where she's crying and begging for the rape to stop while her rapists humiliate her, but secretly having the best orgasm of her life and stuff like that. I could talk about how the book's ending was rewritten to be more publisher-friendly, including adding more trigger warnings at the beginning and toning down the rape scene at the end, but I don't want to help justify why the book's ending was so terrible and incoherent. So the final analysis, what went wrong? It's not just the content, it's the contradiction. The book wants a powerful feminist-leaning premise, but also wants traditional power dynamics in romance, and instead of reconciling those ideas, it just sacrifices the premise. The Poisoner isn't interesting because it's shocking, it's interesting because it shows a pattern where strong female characters are introduced and then stripped of agency in very specific ways. Not by accident, but by design, and once you see it, you can't really enjoy it anymore. Thanks for watching, and comment if you also had issues with the way the Poisoner's strong female protagonist was broken down and made to enjoy her own humiliation and submission.